June 4, 1988, and the Kentucky River Trail stretched for miles along the banks of the winding waterway, a popular hiking destination for families from Louisville who wanted to escape the city heat on summer weekends. The trail was well maintained and clearly marked, with wooden benches positioned every half mile and informational signs explaining the local wildlife and river history that made the area special to Kentucky residents. Nora Blake was 6 years old that Saturday morning, with curly auburn hair pulled into two pigtails and freckles scattered across her nose like constellations, and she wore a bright yellow t-shirt with a sunflower on the front. She'd begged her parents for weeks to go hiking on the river trail after her teacher showed the class pictures of the wildflowers that bloomed there in early summer, and finally, the weekend had arrived. The Blake family started their hike at 9:30 a.m. from the main trailhead parking area, with Nora's father James carrying a backpack full of sandwiches and water bottles, while her mother Linda took photographs of the scenery. Nora's twin brother Nathan walked ahead with his father, collecting interesting rocks and pointing out birds, while Nora stayed closer to her mother because she wanted to pick wildflowers to press in her nature journal. The trail was moderately busy that morning, with at least a dozen other families visible at various points, some ahead and some behind, creating a sense of safety through numbers and shared experience. At mile marker 2, the trail split briefly around a large outcropping of limestone, with both paths rejoining after about 50 yards, and the Blake family naturally divided, with James and Nathan taking the left path. Linda and Nora took the right path, which curved closer to the river and offered better views of the water, and Linda stopped to photograph a cluster of wild iris growing near the trail edge. "Mama, look at these purple ones," Nora called out, pointing to flowers growing about 10 feet off the trail near a fallen log, and Linda looked up from adjusting her camera settings to see what her daughter had found. "Stay on the trail, honey, we'll look at them when I'm done with this shot," Linda said, focusing her lens on the iris while Nora stood patiently waiting with her hands clasped behind her back. Linda took 3 photographs in rapid succession, maybe 15 seconds total, and when she lowered her camera to walk toward Nora's purple flowers, her daughter wasn't standing there anymore. In those 15 seconds on a busy hiking trail in broad daylight with families all around, 6-year-old Nora Blake vanished without a sound, without a scream, without a trace. Before we dive deeper into what happened next, if you're intrigued by unsolved mysteries like this, go ahead and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future cases, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, or what you think might have happened to Nora. And now let's get back to that trail and find out how a little girl disappeared in 15 seconds. "Nora?" Linda called, stepping off the trail toward where her daughter had been standing just moments ago, and she expected to see Nora had simply walked ahead to the purple flowers without waiting for permission. But Nora wasn't by the fallen log, and she wasn't anywhere visible along the path that curved gently toward where it would rejoin the other trail, and Linda's pulse quickened as she scanned the surrounding forest. Linda walked quickly to where the paths converged, certain she'd find Nora waiting with James and Nathan, but when she rounded the limestone outcropping, only her husband and son stood there examining a particularly interesting rock. "Where's Nora?" James asked immediately, seeing Linda arrive alone with confusion spreading across her face, and the question hung in the humid morning air for a terrible moment, before panic replaced confusion. "She was right behind me," Linda said, her voice rising with each word. "I was taking pictures of the iris. She was standing right there. I only looked away for a few seconds." They backtracked immediately to the split in the trail, both parents calling Nora's name while Nathan stood frozen watching his mother's concern transform into something that looked like terror, and other hikers began stopping to ask what was wrong. Within minutes, a dozen people were searching the immediate area, checking behind trees and large rocks and looking down the steep embankment toward the river below. But there was no sign of a little girl in a yellow sunflower shirt anywhere. The trail at that point was bordered on one side by dense forest that extended for miles into Kentucky wilderness, thick with undergrowth and shadows, and on the other side by a 30-foot drop to the river that flowed swift and muddy brown from recent rains. James ran back to the trailhead parking area to alert park rangers while Linda refused to leave the spot where she'd last seen Nora, as if staying there might somehow reverse time and bring her daughter back. A park ranger named Tom Willis reached the scene within 10 minutes and immediately radioed for backup, initiating emergency search protocols that he'd trained for but never actually had to use in his 12 years of service. By 10:45 a.m., Barely an hour after the Blake family had started their peaceful Saturday morning hike, Kentucky State Park Rangers had mobilized a full-scale search and rescue operation for a missing 6-year-old girl. The beautiful summer morning had transformed into every parent's worst nightmare, and the Kentucky River Trail that had seemed so safe and family-friendly had become the site of an incomprehensible disappearance that would haunt the state for decades. Nora Blake had vanished in broad daylight on a moderately busy trail. In the 15 seconds it took her mother to snap 3 photographs of wildflowers, and nobody had seen or heard anything that could explain where she'd gone or how she'd disappeared so completely. Ranger Tom Willis coordinated the initial search with military precision, dividing the trail area into zones and assigning volunteer hikers to search specific sections while waiting for additional rangers to arrive from nearby parks. The first priority was checking the river, because the embankment where Nora had disappeared was steep and unstable, and the terrifying possibility existed that she'd somehow fallen or slid down into the fast-moving water below. 2 rangers rappelled down the slope with safety harnesses and searched both directions along the riverbank for any sign of a yellow shirt or small footprints, but the water had been high from recent storms, and any evidence would have been washed away quickly. Search and rescue dogs arrived at 11:30 a.m., with handlers from the Louisville Fire Department, and they gave the dogs Nora's scent from a jacket she'd left in the family car parked at the trailhead. The dogs immediately began tracking from the spot where Linda had last seen Nora standing, and they followed a scent trail that led off the main path toward the dense forest, moving with certainty that suggested Nora had walked in that direction. But after about 40 yards, the dogs became confused and circled repeatedly in a small clearing, losing the scent entirely as if Nora had simply stopped existing at that exact spot in the middle of the woods. "This doesn't make sense," one handler told Ranger Willis quietly. "The scent just ends here, like she vanished into thin air or was picked up and carried, but there's no scent trail leading back to the path either." Kentucky State Police arrived by noon, and Detective Frank Morrison took command of what was now officially a missing child case, and his first action was to interview every single person who'd been on the trail that morning. Linda Blake sat on a fallen log near where Nora had disappeared, answering Detective Morrison's questions while tears streamed down her face, and her hands wouldn't stop shaking no matter how hard she tried to control them. "Did you see anyone else on the trail near that spot? Anyone who seemed out of place or was watching your daughter?" Morrison asked gently, and Linda closed her eyes trying to remember every detail of those final moments. "There was a man ahead of us, maybe 50 yards. I saw him when we first split from my husband," Linda said slowly. "He was alone, wearing a green jacket and a baseball cap, and I remember thinking it was odd because most people were in groups or families." Morrison immediately radioed this information to other officers who began searching for the man in the green jacket, interviewing everyone still in the parking area and checking if anyone had seen him leave. James Blake had searched until his voice was completely hoarse from calling Nora's name, and he finally collapsed against a tree breathing hard, while Ranger Willis brought him water and tried to keep him calm despite the growing panic. Nathan sat in a ranger's vehicle wrapped in a blanket, even though the temperature was 75 degrees, and he kept asking when Nora would come back, not fully understanding that his twin sister might not come back at all. By 2 p.m., over 60 people were involved in the search, including additional rangers, state police, volunteer firefighters, and civilian volunteers who'd heard about the missing child and wanted to help however they could. Helicopters from the Kentucky National Guard flew grid patterns over the forest, using thermal imaging to search for heat signatures, but the dense tree canopy made it nearly impossible to see the ground clearly from above. The search expanded to cover a 2-mile radius from where Nora had last been seen, with teams walking in careful lines through the forest calling her name and checking behind every tree and rock formation and under every fallen log. Divers from the state police tactical team searched the river downstream from the trail, looking for any sign that Nora had ended up in the water, but the current was strong and visibility was poor in the muddy water. Detective Morrison interviewed a park maintenance worker named Carl Jensen, who'd been trimming vegetation along the trail that morning, and Jensen confirmed he'd seen the man in the green jacket, but hadn't paid much attention to him. "He was just walking the trail like everyone else," Jensen said. "I didn't see him talking to any kids or doing anything suspicious. He was just there and then he wasn't. You know how it is on busy days." Morrison obtained a list of vehicles registered at the trailhead that morning from the parking fee collection box, but several people had paid with cash and left no registration information, creating gaps in the potential witness list. A woman named Patricia Hayes, who'd been hiking with her teenage daughter, reported seeing a little girl matching Nora's description near the trail split, and she remembered the bright yellow sunflower shirt clearly because her own daughter had one just like it. But Patricia hadn't seen the girl after that initial glimpse, and she'd been ahead of the Blake family on the trail, so her timing didn't match up with when Nora had actually disappeared. By evening, the temperature began dropping, and the reality set in that if Nora was lost in the woods, she'd be spending the night alone in the forest without food or water or protection from wildlife. Kentucky forests were home to black bears and coyotes and copperhead snakes, and a 6-year-old child would be vulnerable to all of them, not to mention the danger of hypothermia if temperatures dropped too low overnight. Search teams brought in portable lights and continued working through the night, refusing to give up hope that they'd find Nora cold and scared, but alive, huddled under a tree somewhere waiting for her parents to find her. Sunday morning arrived with fog rolling off the Kentucky River and covering the trail in thick gray mist that made visibility even worse for search teams who'd worked through the night without finding any trace of Nora Blake. Linda and James hadn't slept at all, spending the night at a command post set up near the trailhead where they could monitor search updates and be ready if Nora was found. And Linda's eyes were vacant with exhaustion and terror. The search expanded dramatically on day 2 with over 200 volunteers arriving from Louisville and surrounding counties. People who'd seen the news coverage and wanted to help find the little girl who'd vanished from the river trail. Bloodhounds were brought in from 3 different counties, and they all followed similar patterns, tracking Nora's scent to that same clearing 40 yards into the forest before losing it completely and refusing to go further despite handlers' encouragement. Detective Morrison found this extremely troubling because in his 15 years of experience with search and rescue operations, he'd never seen multiple dogs lose a scent trail in exactly the same spot, unless something very specific had happened there. Either she got into a vehicle at that point, which is impossible because there's no road access, Morrison told his team, or someone carried her from there, or she went into water, but there's no water source in that clearing. The FBI was contacted on Sunday afternoon, and agents from the Louisville field office arrived to assist with the investigation, bringing additional resources and expertise in child abduction cases that local police desperately needed. Agent Sarah Chen reviewed all the evidence and witness statements, and she focused immediately on the man in the green jacket that Linda Blake had seen ahead of them on the trail shortly before Nora disappeared. A composite sketch was created based on Linda's description and the vague recollection of park worker Carl Jensen, showing a white male approximately 35 to 45 years old, with a baseball cap obscuring most of his facial features. The sketch was distributed to every media outlet in Kentucky and surrounding states, and it appeared on the evening news with a hotline number for people to call if they recognized the man or had seen him that Saturday morning. Tips flooded in immediately with dozens of people claiming to recognize the man, but each lead was investigated, and each one led nowhere as witnesses confused timelines or misremembered faces or simply wanted to help but had nothing useful to offer. Nora's case made national news by Monday morning, appearing on Good Morning America and the Today Show, and suddenly the entire country was talking about the little girl who'd vanished in 15 seconds on a Kentucky hiking trail. The Blake family appeared on television pleading for information, with Linda barely able to speak through her tears, while James read a prepared statement asking anyone who knew anything to please come forward and help bring their daughter home. Nora is scared of the dark and she has a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Whiskers that she can't sleep without, Linda whispered into the cameras. Please, if you have her, just let her go somewhere safe. She's only 6 years old and she needs us. Weeks passed with intensive searching every single day, and the Kentucky River Trail became a staging ground for the largest search operation in the state's history, with hundreds of volunteers combing every inch of surrounding forest. But despite the dogs and helicopters and thermal imaging and ground searches and river diving, no trace of Nora Blake was ever found. Not her clothing or her shoes or any physical evidence that she'd been in that forest at all. By July, the active search was scaled back to weekends only, and by August it was officially suspended with the case remaining open but no new leads to pursue and no evidence pointing in any clear direction. The man in the green jacket was never identified despite the sketch being shown across the country, and he became a phantom figure who haunted the investigation, possibly innocent or possibly responsible for whatever happened to Nora that Saturday morning. Detective Morrison kept working the case for years afterward, following up on tips and re-interviewing witnesses, but the trail had gone completely cold, and without physical evidence, There was simply nothing to investigate that hadn't already been exhausted. The Blake family's life shattered into pieces that could never be put back together properly, with Linda developing severe anxiety that made it impossible for her to work or function normally, and James throwing himself into his job to avoid being home. Nathan struggled terribly with survivor's guilt, feeling somehow responsible for his twin sister's disappearance, because he'd chosen to walk with their father instead of staying with Nora and their mother that morning. The family moved away from Louisville in 1990, unable to bear living in the city where everyone knew their story and looked at them with pity, and they settled in Ohio, trying desperately to rebuild some semblance of normal life. But normal was impossible when half of your family was missing, when every birthday and Christmas and ordinary Tuesday carried the weight of Nora's absence, and when every knock on the door brought hope that maybe this time it would be news. Years turned into decades, with 1988 becoming 1990, becoming 2000, and Nora Blake's case remained one of Kentucky's most baffling unsolved mysteries, discussed in true crime forums and featured in documentaries about children who vanished without explanation. The Kentucky River Trail installed security cameras and implemented new safety protocols, and a memorial bench was placed near mile marker 2, with a plaque reading, "In memory of Nora Blake, may her light shine on," and hikers still leave flowers there. October 2011, 23 years after Nora vanished, and Detective Morrison had long since retired from Kentucky State Police, but he'd never stopped thinking about the little girl in the yellow sunflower shirt who'd disappeared on his watch. Morrison kept a copy of the case file in his home office and reviewed it periodically, hoping that fresh eyes or new perspective might reveal something he'd missed during the original investigation all those years ago. On October 15th, Morrison received an unexpected phone call from an FBI agent named Robert Torres, who was working cold cases using new DNA technology that hadn't existed in 1988, and Torres had some interesting information about the Kentucky River Trail. "We've been reviewing unsolved child abduction cases from the 1980s and looking for geographic patterns," Torres explained. "And we found something concerning that connects to 3 different cases, including Nora Blake's disappearance, that I think you need to hear." Torres explained that between 1985 and 1992, 3 children had vanished from state parks and hiking trails within a 200-mile radius of Louisville, all under similar circumstances involving brief moments when parents looked away. In 1986, a 5-year-old boy named Timothy Chen had disappeared from a campground in Indiana while his father was setting up their tent, and in 1991, a 7-year-old girl named Amanda Rodriguez had vanished from a trail in Tennessee while her family stopped for a water break. None of the cases had been solved, no bodies had ever been recovered, and until Torres started analyzing geographic and behavioral patterns, nobody had connected them as potentially related to the same perpetrator. "The methodology is nearly identical in all 3 cases," Torres continued. "Brief distraction, child vanishes without sound or struggle, dogs lose the scent in a specific location, and a lone adult male was reported in the vicinity, but never identified." Morrison felt his pulse quicken because he'd suspected for 23 years that Nora's disappearance wasn't random, that someone had taken her deliberately, but without evidence his suspicions had been nothing more than gut instinct. Torres revealed that the FBI had been developing a profile of a highly organized offender who specifically targeted state parks and trails, someone who knew how to move through wilderness areas without leaving traces, and who understood search patterns. "We believe this individual likely has military or law enforcement training based on his ability to evade detection," Torres said, "and he may have worked or volunteered in parks or outdoor recreation areas, giving him legitimate reasons to be present." This new information prompted a complete review of all personnel who'd worked at Kentucky state parks during the late 1980s, and investigators cross-referenced employee records looking for anyone who'd also had connections to the Indiana and Tennessee locations. One name emerged from the analysis that made Morrison's blood run cold: Robert Dale Hutchinson, who'd worked as a seasonal ranger at Kentucky River Trail State Park during the summer of 1988 and had been on duty the day Nora disappeared. Hutchinson had been interviewed briefly during the original investigation as part of the routine questioning of all park employees, but he'd been cleared because he had an alibi claiming he was patrolling a different section of trail when Nora vanished. But deeper research revealed that Hutchinson had also worked at the Indiana State Park in 1986 and had been a volunteer trail guide in Tennessee in 1991, placing him at or near all 3 locations when children had disappeared. Morrison contacted Torres immediately with this information, and federal investigators began building a comprehensive background on Robert Dale Hutchinson, now 58 years old and living in rural Georgia, working as a hunting guide. Hutchinson had no criminal record, had never been arrested or even seriously questioned about anything, and on paper he appeared to be exactly what he claimed, an outdoorsman who loved working in nature and helping families enjoy wilderness areas. But investigators discovered that Hutchinson had a pattern of abruptly leaving jobs and moving to new states every few years, and his employment history showed gaps that couldn't be easily explained or verified through normal records. Most troublingly, they found that Hutchinson had been present in the vicinity of 2 additional unsolved child disappearances that hadn't been initially connected, one in North Carolina in 1987 and another in West Virginia in 1989. The pattern was undeniable once all the pieces were laid out together. Robert Hutchinson had been within 50 miles of 5 different child abductions over a 7-year period, all involving outdoor recreation areas, all involving similar circumstances. FBI agents obtained a warrant to search Hutchinson's property in Georgia, and on November 3, 2011, they executed the search with a full tactical team because they didn't know if Hutchinson would resist or what they might find. The property was isolated, sitting on 40 acres of dense forest with a small cabin and several outbuildings, and it took agents 6 hours to process everything thoroughly, while Hutchinson sat handcuffed in the back of a patrol car watching silently. In a locked shed behind the cabin, investigators found a collection of children's items that had been carefully preserved and organized: shoes, clothing, hair ribbons, and small toys, each item labeled with a date and location that corresponded to unsolved missing children cases. Among those items was a yellow t-shirt with a sunflower on the front, labeled Kentucky River Trail, June 4, 1988, and forensic analysis would later confirm through DNA that the shirt had belonged to Nora Blake. The discovery of Nora's shirt in Robert Hutchinson's shed changed everything, transforming 23 years of unanswered questions into a focused criminal investigation with physical evidence that could finally bring justice. FBI forensic teams processed every item in Hutchinson's collection with meticulous care, documenting each piece and comparing them to missing children cases from across multiple states, and the results were devastating. The items matched 11 different children who had vanished from parks and trails between 1985 and 1995, creating a trail of victims that spanned a decade and covered 7 states, and every single case had gone unsolved until now. Hutchinson was arrested immediately and charged with 11 counts of kidnapping and murder, though without bodies the murder charges would be difficult to prove in court, and he was transported to a federal detention facility in Atlanta. Detective Morrison flew to Georgia to participate in the interrogation, and after 23 years of wondering what had happened to Nora Blake, he finally sat across a table from the man who held all the answers. Hutchinson remained silent for the first 3 days, refusing to speak with investigators or even acknowledge their questions, sitting motionless with his hands folded and his expression completely blank. But on the 4th day, something shifted, and Hutchinson began talking in a quiet voice that was almost conversational, describing his crimes with disturbing detachment, as if he were discussing the weather or a hiking route. "I never meant to hurt them," Hutchinson said, and Morrison had to clench his fists under the table to keep from reacting to those words. "I just wanted them to stay with me, to be part of something beautiful and pure away from the world." Hutchinson explained his methodology with chilling precision, how he would identify families with young children on trails and observe them from a distance, waiting for the inevitable moment when a parent became distracted. He'd approach the child quickly and quietly, telling them he was a park ranger and their parents had sent him to bring them to the ranger station, and most children trusted the uniform and followed without question or resistance. Hutchinson would take them deep into the forest using trails and paths that only someone with his extensive wilderness knowledge would know existed, areas where search dogs couldn't track and helicopters couldn't see through dense canopy. He'd kept them in remote locations that he'd prepared in advance, old hunting cabins or abandoned structures that were miles from any marked trail, and he'd tried to create what he called a natural family away from civilization. But children inevitably cried for their real parents, refused to eat, became sick without proper care, and Hutchinson's fantasy would collapse under the reality that these were terrified victims not willing participants in his twisted vision. When pressed about what happened to the children, Hutchinson's voice became even quieter, and he said they'd returned to nature, which investigators understood to mean he'd killed them when they became too difficult to control. He refused to provide specific locations of remains, claiming he couldn't remember exactly where each child had been laid to rest after they died, though Morrison suspected he simply wanted to maintain some level of control over the investigation. The case against Hutchinson was overwhelming even without bodies, based on the physical evidence from his shed, his detailed confessions, and testimony from forensic experts who could prove the items belonged to the missing children. Linda Blake received the call about Hutchinson's arrest on a cold November afternoon, and she collapsed in her kitchen, sobbing with a mixture of relief and renewed grief, finally knowing what had happened to Nora after 23 years of torture. James flew to Georgia for the trial, which began in March 2012, and he sat in the courtroom every day watching the man who'd stolen his daughter face consequences that felt simultaneously too severe and completely inadequate. Nathan, now 30 years old and working as a teacher, gave a victim impact statement describing how losing his twin sister had shaped his entire life, the guilt and trauma and questions that had haunted him since he was 6 years old. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts, and the judge sentenced Robert Dale Hutchinson to 11 consecutive life sentences without any possibility of parole or early release. Hutchinson showed no emotion when the sentence was read, sitting motionless just as he had throughout the trial, and he was led away in chains to spend the rest of his life in a maximum security federal prison. Despite extensive searches of areas Hutchinson had frequented, Nora's remains were never recovered, and her family had to accept that they would never be able to lay her to rest or visit a grave where they could leave flowers. The Blake family held a memorial service for Nora in the spring of 2012, finally able to have some form of closure even without her body, and hundreds of people attended to honor the little girl who'd been stolen from the Kentucky River Trail. Linda spoke at the service about how Nora had loved wildflowers and nature, and how she'd only wanted to collect purple flowers to press in her journal, and how one monster had turned that innocent desire into a tragedy. Today, a permanent memorial stands at mile marker 2 on the Kentucky River Trail, featuring a bronze statue of a little girl holding wildflowers and looking toward the forest, and the plaque reads, Nora Elizabeth Blake, 1982-1988, Forever 6, Forever Loved. The case led to major reforms in how state parks handle child safety, including mandatory background checks for all employees, increased surveillance systems on popular trails, and protocols for immediate response when children go missing. Hutchinson remains in prison where he will die, and he's never shown remorse or provided locations where families might recover their children's remains, maintaining his silence as his final act of cruelty. And somewhere in the Kentucky wilderness, in a place only a monster knew, Nora Blake rests beneath the wildflowers she loved so much, her story a reminder that evil can hide behind a uniform and a smile, and that some answers come too late to ease the pain they're meant to resolve.